So how do we even begin to make sense of writings that seem to completely defy logic? Mystical texts. They can be incredibly profound, super inspiring, but they can also be dangerously misunderstood. And here's the thing. When you're dealing with these kinds of ideas, getting the interpretation wrong isn't just some academic oopsie. It can literally have life or death consequences. Okay, for a perfect example, let's look at this statement from a 10th century Sufi mystic, a guy named Mansur al-Hallaj. Just 4 simple words. Ana al-Haq. I am the absolute truth. Now, this is easily one of the most famous and controversial statements in the entire history of mysticism. But what on earth does it actually mean? Well, for the religious authorities back in Baghdad, the meaning was crystal clear: blasphemy. And for saying those 4 words, al-Hallaj was publicly executed. So that right there is the core mystery, isn't it? Did he mean he was literally God? Or was he trying to put words to an experience so profound, so overwhelming, that our normal language just falls apart? And maybe the biggest question of all is, how can we, 1,000 years later, have any hope of knowing for sure? And that question leads us straight into the core dilemma for anyone, and I mean anyone, who tries to interpret these kinds of texts. See, you're basically caught between 2 equally powerful but opposite dangers. Okay, so on one hand, if you get too close, you run into something called proximity bias. This is where you start projecting your own beliefs, your own experiences onto the text. You basically end up seeing what you want to see. But on the other hand, if you stay too far away, you risk this cold, clinical, literal reading that just completely misses the deeper meaning. You might not see anything at all. So the million-dollar question is, how do you find that perfect distance? Well, it turns out there's a modern framework that offers a new toolkit designed for this exact problem. It's called the Hermeneutics of Parallelism, or HoP for short. Now, the really interesting thing about HoP is that its goal isn't to find the one single correct interpretation. Nope. Instead, it's all about creating a system for a more honest debate about meaning. And the way it does this is pretty clever. It carefully maps the positions of both the original author and, crucially, the person doing the interpreting, the researcher. And that brings us to the first really crucial idea in HoP. It starts by turning the lens around, away from the text, and pointing it right back at the interpreter. The idea is simple. Before we can even hope to understand the text, we have to understand the biases we bring to it. The biggest challenge here is that proximity bias we just talked about, that completely natural tendency we all have to see a text through the lens of our own beliefs. And here's the first big innovation of HoP. It recognizes that you can't just wish this bias away. You can't eliminate it. But what you can do, and what you absolutely must do, is manage it. So how do you manage it? Well, HoP gives us 2 key tools. First up is something called an epistemic declaration. The idea is actually pretty simple, but it's also kind of radical. The researcher just transparently declares their own background, their beliefs, anything relevant to the text. It's like putting all your cards on the table before the game even starts. Then you have the second tool, critical reflective control, or KRC. Think of this as a continuous, ongoing audit of your own interpretation. You're constantly asking yourself, wait, is that the text saying that, or is that just me? When you put these 2 together, you get research that's way more honest and, importantly, auditable by others. Okay, so that's how we manage our own lens. But what about the author's side of the equation? This is where HoP gets really fascinating. It reveals that a lot of these mystics, especially the ones living in really dangerous times, weren't just being vague for the sake of it. They were deliberately hiding their real meaning as a survival strategy. This strategy has a name: protective language, or in Indonesian, Bahasa Pelindung. And it's basically the art of using totally conventional, safe-sounding language to embed a really profound, even radical, mystical insight right there in plain sight. So it's not really about deception. It's much more of a brilliant survival mechanism. And this is a perfect illustration of that idea in action. What you're seeing here is a comparison of 3 different Sufis, all living in 10th century Baghdad. So over on the left, you've got our guy, al-Hallaj. His strategy? Well, HoP calls it the stripping tactic. Basically, he used zero protective language. He just said his truth straight up. And we all know how that ended for him. Now, in the middle, that's his teacher, Junaid. He took a completely different approach. He used what's called architecture, a really systematic, carefully built framework of orthodox language to safely house his mystical ideas. And then over on the right, we have al-Shibli. His method was more organic. He basically adopted this elusive, kind of eccentric personality that made his radical ideas almost impossible to pin down. So think about that. 3 mystics, same city, same time, but 3 totally different strategies for survival. So after all that, what's the big payoff? Why go through all this trouble? What does this framework actually give us? Well, what it does is it moves the entire conversation about what these texts mean onto much more solid and much more honest ground. See, by applying a really rigorous step-by-step workflow like the one shown in this diagram here, HoP lets us visually map an author's probable position right alongside the researcher's own declared position. And what that does is it adds this crucial layer of rigor to a field that, let's be honest, can often feel completely subjective. And I want to be really clear about this. The goal isn't to declare a final verdict. It's not about saying this interpretation is right and that one is wrong. A better way to think about it is that HoP creates a kind of courtroom for interpretation. It gives us the tools to finally understand why 2 smart people can read the exact same text and come to completely different conclusions. We can look at the researcher's declared position, we can analyze the author's likely use of protective language, and we can finally have a much more productive, much more informed debate. And all of this leads us to one final and pretty provocative question. If we accept that every single interpreter is standing somewhere, that their biases can be mapped and audited, then HoP forces us to ask a really fundamental question about knowledge itself. Does a truly objective interpretation, a view from nowhere of any text even exist? Or is the most we can ever really hope for just a more honest, more transparent account of where we stand when we start reading?